Great. What I'd like to cover today, a number of tshuvas which are called Piskei Corona by Rav Hershel Shechter Shlita. And the first one is about Avelus and a whole bunch of different tshuvas. I also have some answers that Rav Willig gave, Rav Mordechai Willig Shlita, to questions. Perhaps we'll mention Rav Yitzchak Zilberstein as we go along, and some other posts. So the first question, if you happen to have printed out any of the pages that I asked you in the email, this is called Piskei Corona number 23. Okay then? And what we're interested is number one, Pinui Ames, and this is quite a common phenomenon, but especially during the Corona virus, and that is to bury someone in Chutz La'aretz and expect to re-inter him in Eretz Yisrael. And this is an explicit Shulchan Aruch in Yoredei Simon Reish Samach Yud. In general, the halach is not favor of what's called Pinui Atzamos, Likut Atzamos, to take the bones, the remains of a person out of their kever and rebury them elsewhere. But under certain circumstances, when it was very, very impossible to get the person to be buried exactly where he was meant to be buried, then l'chatchila you're allowed to bury the person al manas with the explicit condition that the person be reburied in Eretz Yisrael. So it's important that l'chatchila, when the burial takes place, and certainly when the body is removed from the ground, this is all for the sake of burial in Eretz Yisrael. And as I mentioned before, today is the shloshim for my father-in-law, who succumbed to this disease, and for the meantime, we had to bury him in Chutz La'aretz. So this is, his parents are buried literally a half hour's walk from here on Har HaMenuchot, from where I'm talking. But the main discussion that I want to have with you about Avelus is the next piece here, which is also part of the same psak. And the question is, first and foremost, when does Aninus end and Avelus begin? And this question has many ramifications. An onen, before the burial of one of his close relatives, is enjoined from not only eating meat and drinking wine, but basically from all mitzvahs. And it's not an option. You know, an onen is not even permitted to perform a mitzvah, make a bracha. And the question is, in today's situation, where it's very difficult to, number one, bury the dead immediately after the neshama leaves, and number two, it's very difficult for the members of the family to participate in the burial. For example, in the case of my father-in-law, almost all of us were able to watch the kvura on Zoom. Only about 3 or 4 members of the immediate family, including my wife, were able to be there at the kvura, so that almost anyone who buried my father-in-law was a member of the Chevra Kadisha. So for the Avelim, who are now in a state of Aninus, at what point does Aninus terminate? We have a principle in Shulchan Aruch, which is called Nastul Ktefayim. What that means is that at some point, if the burial doesn't take place within a very short period of time, and the body is sort of in a place where whenever the burial will take place, but it's out of the hands of the family members, then at that point, Aninus terminates, which means that all the laws of Andinus and the status of an onain are all generated by the fact that the person, the relative, is involved in some way preparing for the burial, whether it mean inviting people to the burial, whether it mean being in touch with the Chevra Kadisha to make sure that everything is going smoothly. In some cases, it means getting a death certificate. In other cases, it might mean writing a hesped, preparing a eulogy. And in many, many situations today, none of the above is relevant. So here's the question that appears in paragraph number 1. I'm just going to summarize it. The relative, the living relative, has no hope to travel to the Beis HaKvaros and to participate in the burial of his close relative. Whatever he could do to set up the anticipated burial, he's already done. He's been in touch through the telephone with the Chevra Kadisha. He has set up perhaps an internet connection so that people could participate from a distance in the burial. And the psak here is, that's called Masru L'Ktefayim, which literally means they gave it over to the shoulders. Shoulders means those who will carry the dead. Now, in a general case, you could always ask, forget about Corona time, why doesn't Aninus end as soon as the Chevra Kadisha takes over the body? I mean, what more should the members of the family be doing? And the answer is because Aninus continues until the actual burial. It's not enough to say, well, the Chevra Kadisha will take all the responsibility off my shoulders. But there's a period of time between Misa and Kvura, and Aninus bridges that period of time, because until the actual burial takes place, then the onain is emotionally and even to some extent physically involved in leading up to this burial. But in the case of Corona, where in many situations the relatives, the Avelim, will not participate in the Kvura, so what bridges them between the Misa and the Kvura? There is no Kvura that they're going to be involved in. They won't even be present for the Kvura. And in this tshuva, he presents the following, that number one, as long as the members of the family are going to use the internet in order that other people besides themselves will participate in the funeral, again, participate in inverted commas, then it would make sense, he says, that involvement in seeing to it that as many people as possible will, again, I use that word, participate in the kvura, that is also part of the responsibility that falls on the shoulders of the Avelim, and therefore their aninus will continue. And he goes on and he says that even liachar, even after all the preparations and the arrangements with the Chevra Kadisha or with the funeral parlor and the burial society, whoever it is, all that has been taken care of, but nevertheless, the Avel could still be involved by using the telephone to invite his relatives, his friends, to notify them about the exact time that the funeral is meant to take place, how they could get linked up through Zoom, for example, with the funeral, as was the case with my father-in-law. And therefore, he says the onain has not completed his, quote, his askus bekvura. Aninus is generated by and continues as long as this is askus bekvura. And therefore, the state of aninus continues as long as the avelim are in some way involved in the kvura. Even though you might argue it's very minimum, all they're doing is trying to locate the people, notify them. People are isolated, they're quarantined, and he wants to notify them, whether it's people here, perhaps people abroad in different countries, how they can get in touch through the telephone or through the internet to link up with the Kfura. And therefore, he says the Aninus will continue. However, when we get to the point in which the Avel has done whatever he could do, he will not participate in the actual burial. He is no longer able to contact any people. He's done whatever he could. Would it be enough to continue his Avelus? Because he himself will, again, using that word selectively, participate in the funeral derech Zoom. Yesh l'stapek. He says, I vacillate on this point. Can you consider the Kvura when you're not there at the time of the burial? You're only going to see it through the internet as participation in the Kvura. And he says he's not sure whether or not now this concept that Kvura means that you have to be there physically, as opposed to long distance on Zoom, is going to come up over and over again in so many different issues. And in each case, it might be a little bit different. Here, it seems that the Meshiv did not come to any conclusion. It's not clear, he writes. What's the status of a mourner who can no longer communicate with others about attending or watching the funeral? He personally will participate in the funeral from a distance by watching or perhaps only listening to the funeral. Is he considered an onen? To what extent does Kvura mean the actual Kvura, or at least being there at the time of the Kvura, or is it enough to have some sort of connection to the Kvura? And again, it seems to me, I'm just saying what my own humble opinion, is that Kvura has two distinct parts to it. One part is the mitzvah of Kvura, and the other part is kavod hames. And it seems to my limited understanding that kavod hames is part of the mitzvah of Kvura, albeit it's not the full-fledged mitzvah for sure. I would never say that an Avel has fulfilled his obligation vis-a-vis Kvura because he is on the phone from long distance. But in these situations where there's nothing else possible, then a person would still be considered an onen. He's taking care of the Chevra Kadisha. He's taking care of inviting whoever he could. He set up the Zoom, but he himself will now, to some extent, be part of the kavod hames by doing the maximum that he could do. Again, one could very easily reject what I said and blow it away, because is that really kavod hames just because you pressed on the computer on one Zoom button? I don't know if that's called kavod hames. By the way, it's definitely kavod achai if you show up for a Zoom shir, for the Magid shir. That I'm telling you, just as we pass. Now, Rav Shechter writes this tshuva right before Pesach. So we're really turning back the clock about a month ago. But there's a fascinating issue here that I wanted to discuss with you. And that is a machlokes between Tosfos and the Or Zarua about Erev Pesach, after Chatzos. So imagine it's the time when the Mikdash stood, that the Korban Pesach was brought, and the Or Zarua, one of the Balei Tosfos, I have one here, comes to the pretty revolutionary conclusion based on various sources that the afternoon of Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan, has the status of a yontif, because whenever a person has to bring a korban, that's called a yontif. In this case, the korban is brought on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. And that's something that every Jew is obligated in, at least back at the time of the Beis Hamikdash. And that endows Erev Pesach after Chatzos with the status of Yontif. And therefore, there's no Avelus whatsoever on Yontif. And in this case, on the 14th of Nisan after Chatzos. Tosfos disagrees. And he says, no. The fact that Erev Pesach is the time for the Korban Pesach, that's not enough to create a din of Yontif. And the Avel will continue his Avelus even on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. The Ramah relies on the Arzarua La'alocha, and the Achronim say that the reason for that is because when it comes to Avelus, we have a principle called Halacha Kedivrei HaMekel B'Avel. In any controversy over the laws of Avelus, we rely on the lenient position. Here, the Arzarua is the more lenient position because he terminates the Avelus with Chatzos on Erev Pesach. And a similar halacha, for example, we find with regard to Orla, that in Chutz La'aretz, if you have a suffix in Orla, or if there's a machlokes and there are mekilim and machmirim in a suffix in Orla, we go like the mekil. That's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and a similar parallel halacha applies to Avelus. So the Ramah is going to paskin like the sheet of the Arzarua, and there's no Avelus on Erev Pesach. Rav Shechter makes 2 points. One point is that based on this Ramah, who codifies the Arzarua, it's very important for the Avel on the 14th of Nisan to terminate his Avelus before Chatzos. Because if he doesn't, if he waits till after Chatzos, then he, in a sense, is undermining the status of Erev Pesach after Chatzos as a Yont by continuing Nihuge Avel. But I'm more interested in the second point. He asks the following. What happens if somebody, Nebuch, lost a relative, one of his 7 close relatives, shortly before Erev Pesach? At this point, he's an Onen. And then you hit Chatzos. What happens when you hit Chatzos? It becomes a Yontif, according to the Ramah, based on the Arzarua. Now here there's going to be a tremendous nafkamina. Why? Because an Onen is not an Avel. He's not involved in Yehuge Avelus. Again, he's enjoying from drinking wine or eating meat, but he's not knowing his Avelus. Now, when Yontif comes, we have a principle called Yontif Mevatel Shiva. However, here's the difference. If he began his Nihuge Avelus even 1 moment before Yontif, then Yontif Mevatel Shiva, and he immediately begins Shloshim after Yontif. He doesn't have Shiva at all. If, on the other hand, Yontif came before he was Noeg his Avelus, then the entire Shiva is lifted like a crane and put down and is Noeg after Yontif. So there's a big nafkamina here. Why? Because we want to know if he was able to be Noeg his Avelus after midday on Erev Pesach. If he was, if he's allowed to be Noeg Avelus, then when Yontif begins, then he's going to be completely free, so to speak, if I could use that term, from Shiva, because Yontif is a Mevatel Shiva. If, on the other hand, we see Erev Yontif after Chatzos on Pesach, Erev Pesach, as a Yontif, then he hasn't started his Avelus. He's an Onen. Let's say they bury the dead at 2 p.m. on Erev Pesach, right? So in this case, since we go like the Arzarua, then it means that Yontif is Mevatel Shiva, and he went straight from Aninis into Yontif without any Nihut Avelus. He's going to be required to be Noeg Avelus 7 days after Pesach. So where do we apply and how do we apply the principle of halacha kedivrei hamekel ba'avel? On the one hand, we want to say that on Erev Yontiv after Chatzos, we're going to paskin l'kula like the Arzarua, as the Ramah does, and there's no Avelus. But on the other hand, now you're imposing upon him a tremendous chumrah because you are paskening now that the Yontif of Erev Pesach is going to be Mavatal Shiva in a way that it prevents him from even beginning his Avelus. And therefore Yontif is going to push the Avelus of Shiva off for a week, and then a week later he will have to sit Shiva. So it's a strange kind of thing. You have here a combination of a kula and a chumrah. If we accept the kula of the Arzarua and we endow Erev Yontiv Def Chatzos with the status of a Yontiv, then there's no possibility for the Avel to be knowing his Avelus, which is a kula. But on the other hand, it's a chumrah because by blocking the possibility of his being knowing Avelus, he's going to have to push out Shiva until after Pesach. So Rav Shechter says, Yesh l'stapek, v'ezek kivun nomar lahakel. Should we say lahakel, shelo lahaskil oz Shiva? He doesn't begin his Shiva, so he doesn't have to be knowing his Avelus. But Memela, by freeing him of Avelus, yitztarich linog Shiva liachar Pesach. There's a chumrah now that he's going to need 7 days of Shiva after Pesach. Alternatively, he says, Yesh lahakil lemayit b'Shiva, ulahaskil Shiva taketh b'erev Pesach yeshitas hatosvos. Why don't we say halacha kedivrei hamekil, and we'll allow him to be knowing his avelus on erev Pesach, such that now the regel of Yontiv is mevatel Shiva, and he won't have any Shiva. He won't be chayav in Shiva after Yontiv. A beautiful suffix. And in the last line of this paragraph, which is the last paragraph on this page, he writes, "Kividumali shaminig haposhenu kehatzad hasheni." That we're going to take the second latter position, and that Shiva is going to be batil completely, because we're going to allow the Avel, like Shitas HaTosfos, to be knowing his Avelus after Chatzos on Erev Pesach. And therefore, Shiva is going to be completely batil, nullified, and undermined by the regel of Pesach. Rabbosai, there's one thing here that I can't figure out. He writes, in explaining the second side, which he says the minhag has accepted, now it's very strange, because the very moment he writes Lamayit, he's reflecting the Rambam, who is Mekil after Chatzos on Erev Pesach, like the Arzarua, that is a status of Yontif. So instead of imposing upon him the full, lock and barrel Isure and Yehuge Avelus, we're going to be Mamayit. We're going to limit it. Because, after all, the Arzarua says that it's Yontif. So what I don't understand here is, how could he be Noeg his Avelus? Now, there's another piece of the puzzle here that I want to point out. Rav Shechter doesn't point out here that his Aninus has terminated, right? In order for Shiva to be Batel through Regel, have to say that he's no longer an Oneg. So Rav Shechter doesn't point this out, but I think if I had to write a letter to the editor, I would add the following sentence. And they buried the mess on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. Now that's a little bit of a push because we're talking about Corona. How likely is it that sometime after noon on Erev Pesach, they'll be able to bury the dead? I don't even know if the Chever Kaddish is working on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. They're too busy preparing the Korban Pesach, if you know what I mean. But in any event, I think we have to add that one piece of the puzzle here, because if you want to say that Regel is Mavatal Shiva, and he was knowing his Avelus, you're going to have to somehow make the transition from Aninus to Avelus, unless maybe what Rav Shechter is saying here is that since the Avel could not participate in the burial, not now and not later or so, then his aninus terminates. And Memela, he begins his Avelus even before Kvura. That's very possible. But I have another problem. Are we involved in what we call a Tarti Desastre? How do you define Erev Pesach after Chatzos? If you accept the Shitas HaTosfos, fine and well. He has a full Avelus after Chatzos, and with those Nihugim, comes along the regal and it's Mavatal Shiva. But if you're going like the Ozarua, then there's no possibility of Nihug Avelus after Chatzos because it's Yontif. And therefore he'd have to observe 7 days of Shiva after Yontif. And somehow, at this point in the discussion, the Arzarua falls off the edge of the earth. I mean, we're going straight with Tosfos, but yet he admits that Ramah accepts the Arzarua Lahakel as far as being Noeg Avelus. And I don't know, he comes up with some sort of, I call it a compromise, some sort of a nishtaher, nishtahin of being Memait the Avelus. In other words, we're going to take the sheet of Tosfos and we're going to say that that Regel is going to be Vatel Shiva because he already started his Avelus on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. So in that sense, we're relying on Shitas HaTosfos L'Kula and Halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel. On the other hand, we're going to be Mekel to some extent, and that's maybe what the Ramah had in mind, and be lenient in terms of the Nihudei Avel on Erev Pesach to give some sort of respect to the Yontif status, according to the Arzarua, of Erev Pesach after Chatzos. And is this a Tarti Desastre? You can't say that that a period of time is both Mincha and Ma'ariv, right? So I'm going to say here, either you accept the Arzarua and it's Yontif, or you reject the Arzarua and there's Avelus, and therefore you don't have Shiva. But I don't understand how you can be Mekil on the one hand like the Arzarua and say there is no Avelus on Erev Yontif, and then you're going to be Mekil like the Balei HaTosfos and say that he was already knowing his Avelus on Erev Yontif. The best I can do with this is to say that Tarti Desastre doesn't apply in Avelus when you have two different issues. There's one issue about a certain period of time, that slice of time from Chatzos until nightfall on the 14th of Nisan. Is it Yontif? Is it not Yontif? And then you have another issue of whether or not he has to be knowing his Avelus after Yontif. And we're going to separate these two, even though conceptually we're going to come to a contradiction on a conceptual level. But nevertheless, there are two different shilas, and every shilah we're going to paskin K'divrei HaMekel. So if you're asking me, does he have a real chiyuv avelus on Erev Pesach after Chatzos? I'm going to be making like the Arzarua. If you're asking me, can he have some sort of niyug avelus in order to be docha his avelus? I'm going to paskin like the Balei HaTosfos.
Rav, how do we do it with regards to sukkahs? If you have, if somebody, because you have sukkahs and then you have Shmini Atzeres, which sukkahs in some way, if it knocks off the Shmini Atzeres, knocks off the 30 days. Sukkahs knocks off the right, and then Shmini Atzeres knocks off the 30 days. So nobody's saying that this, if you're going to say that the 14th is going to knock off the Avelus, and now
you mean like the
Chag, right? And then the Chag's going to knock off the Shloshim as well. Nobody says that, so isn't that forcing him to say that this is a Tarta Desastre? You got to have to say that. Again,
I'm not sure what you mean by knocking off Shloshim. I mean, that's another discussion. But I don't think Rav Shecht is aware of this Tarti Desastre. At least it's not here in the Tshuva. I mean, this was Berzon's problem, Tarti Desastre, because what I see here in the Tshuva is that he's going to start with his Avelus on Erev Pesach in order that he should completely undermine his Shiva. And at the same time, the Ramah is pasking like the Arzarua that Erev Pesach is not a time for Avelus. So how do you reconcile that? That Rav Shechter doesn't address. I'm just assuming that this halacha K'divrei HaMekel Ba'avel could lead us to two different answers to two questions which are conceptually interdependent. But Joe, if you don't mind, let me go on. And again, after we finish, I'll be, I know you're running to do your Harvey thing. So, but if maybe we could find another time to,
No problem. Just
if you don't mind, I just have a lot to cover, and I'm very eager. I know that there are all sorts of pressures here, so I just want to see what we can accomplish. He has another fascinating question here about the Sudas Havra. Now, the Sudas Havra means that the first meal of Avelus should not come from the food of the Avel, it should be provided by others, and even the preparation of the food should be done by others. And here's the question that he addresses. Let's imagine that it's very difficult, if at all possible, to get any of the, let's say, friends, neighbors, etc., to bring him a Sudas Havra during coronavirus. And in such a case, would we allow him to prepare his own meals? And would we do away with this very important minhag of the Sudas Havra? The issue really gets down to the following. What is this Sudas Havra all about? Is it about Nichum Avelus or is it about Nihuge Avelus? Let me explain. One way of understanding it is that Chazal imposed an obligation, at least for the first meal of Shiva, upon the Menachamim, those who have a responsibility to console the mourner, to bring him, the mourner, the first meal. That's one way of understanding the institution of Sudas Havra. The other way of understanding it is that's Nihuke Ovel. The mourner has to demonstrate to what extent he is completely overwhelmed and distressed by his mourning, his grief. And the very fact that he is completely dependent upon others and he cannot even dream about preparing his own food, that itself is a kiyum of kavod hames, it's a kiyum of avelus. And he says the following, that if the issue of Sudas Havra is nichum avelun, then in this case, where the avelun have no way possible to get to the base Avel during the coronavirus, then forget about Sudas Havra. The whole institution is a non-starter. But if on the other hand it's part of Nihuge Avelus, then this is a very serious Easter. Again, we're not going to tell him to give his life up for this, but he should not be eating his own food. And Rav Shechter thinks he has a proof from the halach itself that Sudas Havra lahalacha, again, there are many shittas, is not because of Avelus, but it's because of Nichum Avelus. And where does he find a proof for this? This has to do with the case of Chol HaMoed. Is there Sudas Havra on Chol HaMoed? On the one hand, if a person buried his dead during Chol HaMoed, there's no Avelus. Avelus in that case, as we said before, will be postponed till after the Yont. But nevertheless, there is Nichum Avelus. And Rav Shechter sees in the codes, you can go through the sources here if you like, that there would be Sudas Havra on Chol HaMoed. That's our minhag. That's how we've accepted the halacha. It means that since there's Nichum Avelim even on the Regel, which means on Chol HaMoed, not on Yontiv itself, but on Chol HaMoed. For Sfaradim, maybe even on Yontiv, that's a different story. But for Ashkenazim, on Chol HaMoed, there's a possibility of Nichum Avelim, and therefore the Menachamim should bring the meal to the Avel because of Nichum Avelim. But obviously, in the case of Corona, that obligation is completely lifted, and therefore there will be no halach of Sudas Havra in the case where there's no possibility for the Menachamim to come and be Menach. Okay, there's a discussion here about tefillin. I'm not sure. I'll put it on the side just to see if we'll have time to get back to this a little bit later. At this point, if you happen to have the pages, we're looking at Piskei Corona number 22. And we're going to combine that with number 18. But again, the numbers, I'm changing the order of the numbers because of the logical progression. Rav Shechter wants to know about first a case of a bris. There's no way that, for example, the grandparents could be present at the bris of their grandson. However, they could participate long distance on Zoom. And what level of participation can the grandfather, for example, have over Zoom in the bris of his grandson? Number one, as far as Kriyat Shem is concerned, which starts with Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu with Tefillah of Kayim and Sayel Ezeli Aviv v'Imo v'Yikar Shmo b'Yisrael, that we can certainly allow for the grandfather to do over Zoom, because this is a matter of publicity, to publicize the name of the child, fine. But what about the bracha of Asher Kidesh Yedid Mi Beten, which usually is given as a package with the person who's the Korei Shem? Rav Shechter says that has to be a bracha that's recited Bifnei Atino. Remember, like we were asking before about Kvura, whether or not you have to be there with the mess in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Kvura. Here's also an interesting, similar kind of a question in a very far distant parallel way. Can the bracha be recited Asher Kidesh Yedid Mi Beten over this bris milah from a distance? And we say that this bracha requires the actual presence of the baby. You want to pray about the baby, that's fine. The word hazeh doesn't mean that you have to point to the baby in front of you. Hazeh means re'iyah, that I can see the baby. So I see him and I can point to him through Zoom. That's enough to bestow that blessing upon him and give him the name. But as far as the bracha is concerned, the bracha requires the tinok lifanenu. And this bracha, he says, was established over the bris itself. I want to talk to you, B'li Neder, a little bit later about Pidyon HaBen over Zoom, if we get a chance. But first, what about Shema brachas? We have a wedding. We have a chuppah. Who's there? Who's present at the chuppah? If there's quarantine requirements, then what you have is the chassan, the kala, the Rav HaMasada. You have two witnesses, and who knows if you're going to have a minyan. And what about Sheva brachos? So why not zoom in? Shechter says no. Sheva brachos is only for the mishtatfim, those who participate in the simcha, when it's b'makom hachasan v'kala. There's a halacha called birchas chasanim b'makom chasanim, b'beis chasanim. In the beis chasanim, the chiyuv of this bracha, this series of 7 brachas emerges, and those who are in the beis chasanim, if they make up a minyan, they will recite the brachos, but not those who are watching on Zoom. And I want to come back to this in just a minute, but if you will fast forward now to number 18, you will see that Rav Shechter comes to the conclusion that in a case of a chuppah, of a wedding during Corona, he says that since we cannot gather together a minyan, we'll basically have the following. As we said before, the chassan and the kala will have the Rav HaMasada. We have 2 witnesses. And if we can't get 10 men together, there will be no birchas erusin. There'll only be a bracha on the kedusha. So basically you'll have a badekin, where the chassan gets to see the kala, check out that nobody fooled him and she's there. Then there'll be birchas erusin. There'll be a nesinas hatabas in front of two witnesses, and that's it. Finito. There is no Sheva Brachos. You could have 100 people or 1,000 people watching on Zoom, but Sheva Brachos requires Makom HaChasan, Beis Chasanim, and not from a distance. Rak HaMitztarfin, B'Makom HaChasan V'Kala, Yecholim Levarech Sheva Brachos. Now, he adds another point. He says, let's ask whether Sheva Brachos requires a minyan because of what we call a Davar Shebekducha and Davar Shebekducha Pachos Me'asara. And then he says it's upgrade. It goes without saying that Zoom is not going to give it to you. And we're going to see this over and over again today, Mitzvah Hashem, depending on how much time we have, that there's no such thing as a Davar Shebekducha over Zoom. It just don't exist. But even if I tell you, he says, that Sheva Brachos is not a Davar Shebekdusha, nevertheless, I still require as an absolute condition Asara Mishtatfim Biyachad B'Simcha Lifnei B'Makom Chasim V'Kala. Again, if it's a Davar Shebekdusha, Zoom ain't going to help you. That doesn't even get off the ground. But even if it's not a Davar Shebekdusha, the halacha requires 10 Mishtatfim B'Simcha. These are what we call the Shushvinan, those who are part of the Simcha. And in order for them to be Mishtatik B'Simcha, they have to be there with the Chasim V'Kala in order to recite the Sheva. So Rabosai, I'm nobody to argue against Rav Shecht. I just want to tell you what I think is the proper way in this halachic maze. Again, Lefiani is daiti with all the covet in the world. There are two different dinim in Sheva Brachos. There's Sheva Brachos under the chuppah, and there's Sheva Brachos during the Shivas Yimei HaMishta. I don't have a shadow of a doubt that for Sheva Brachos during the 7 days of Mishta, Zoom is worthless. Zoom is not going to give you what we call a Su'uda Simcha. The Machayev of Sheva Brachos for 7 days is the Su'uda itself. And those who participate in the Suda in the presence of the Chasim V'Kala, there's a whole issue in poskim. What if the Chasim walks out? What if the Kala walked out? There's even one sheet that if both of them have to walk out, we can still recite Sheva Brachos over the Su'uda itself. And the Sheva Brachos is attached to Birkas HaMazon. It becomes a critical addendum to Birkas HaMazon. Zoom is not going to do it for you. That's not called the Shtatfus B'Suda Simcha. But under the Chuppah, that's a whole different story. Under the chuppah, the chiyuv Sheva Brachos really belongs to the chassan himself. But Avram ben Aramah says, all right, he'll give out the kibudim to others because shalol levayishas misheini yodea. We don't know. Not every chassan is. They didn't have printed sidurim. Is capable of remembering 7 brachos by heart. So he gives out the kibudim. Again, don't tell this to the Kala's side. But all Sheva Brachos under the chuppah belong to the Chassan. Okay, that's our secret. And therefore, what he has to do through these Sheva Brachos is express his thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's got to know that 10 people are there to participate in the sense that they hear his brachos. And for that, perhaps, Zoom is enough. So, for example, the Gemara tells us that we derive Sheva Brachos from Boaz, and Boaz, Vayikach Asara Miziknei Ha'ir, Vayomer Shvu Po, and then he recited Sheva Brachos. It means that the Chassan has to gather together the Sheva Brachos. It's not like the case of the 7 days of Mishnah. That obligation is part of the Chiyuv Simcha that's incumbent upon those who participate in the Simcha. They have to be Mesameach the Chasim V'Kala. And the Gemara says in Brachos, the Simchas Chasim V'Kala, that they have to be Mesameach is B'dibur. And some say B'dibur means, to make jokes or whatever they do, or to praise the Chasim, praise the Kala, you know what I mean? But others say it's the Sheva Brachos. That's the way that they're Mesameach the Chasim V'Kala. And, they can't do that from a distance. To be Mesameach the Chasim V'Kala means to participate in the actual Simcha. And therefore, in number 18, which we just saw before, where Rav Shechter writes that if it's a sakana gedol, it's asef chavura sanoshim l'makom echad, right? We have this need for isolation and quarantine, and to be makadesh and isha, we need two edim, we need the Masada Kiddushin, l'chatchilu, we need asara. He says, "Aval b'shasat chak, you can't get asara. We're not going to undermine the wedding, but birchas nisuin requires asara likuva." He doesn't have even a blink of a shadow of a doubt that you need 10 people for birchas nisuin. I don't disagree with him with that, but the question is, do they all have to be there and participate in the simcha, which requires bifnei achas v'kala? That I'm not sure of that, because in the case of the nisuin itself, there the bracha is the obligation incumbent on the chassan himself, and he has to publicize. And if you remember, we discussed earlier whether you could recite, that was last week or so, you could recite Birchas HaGomel over Zoom. And those who are Mekil would say that Birchas HaGomel requires 10 people, not as a Davar Shebekdusha, but rather as a Farhesia in order to publicize Hashem's praise. And that you could do even over Zoom. God, you've saved me. And the chassan has to say to the Ribbon Shalom, if he has a good, proper, positive attitude about marriage, God, you've saved me. I was half a person, and now I'm a full person. And this is all because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Korea Yamsuf, and he brings together the chassan and kal. So that bracha is a public thanks that the chassan has to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then he writes something else, l'shitaso, that there's no possibility if you can't get 10 people together to recite Birchas Nesuin, then we have another problem here. Kala b'lo bracha, asur l'bayla kenida. He's not going to be able to consummate the marriage. Because if he can't make Sheva brachos, then it's kala b'lo bracha. So he says that the bracha is not ma'akev, even though it says kenida. And b'shas hadchak, we're going to rely on this opinion. He finds one opinion in the Nod Yehuda that the brachos are not ma'akiv. I don't know what to do with kenida. I don't know what we're going to do with that. So let him just do the badekin. Let him do the chuppah in front of the kedushin in front of two edim, and he'll have yichud without asara, and there won't be birchas chassan. See, I would have said it a little differently, Lefiani Estaiti. I would say that everybody would agree in this case that he's allowed to consummate the marriage, and we don't say kala b'lo bracha asur l'bayla kenida. The reason for that is because the oser of kala shelo bracha is the chovas bracha. Notice if he's not makayim his chovas bracha, he's got 10 people and he refuses to make this bracha, that generates an isur nida. Because he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. In a case where it's impossible to get 10 people together, he's not obligated in those brachos. And I would say in that case, you would not apply the principle of asura kebayla kenid. Now, I mentioned earlier about the issue of a pidyon ben. A person is in isolation, and the Kohen is not willing to show up. I shouldn't say that because that's a little bit harsh. What I mean to say is the Kohen is not allowed to show up. So what do we do about pidyon ben? And the issue here is what we call the issue of shlichus. Does the father have to give the money to the Kohen hand to hand, or is it enough that he gives it over to a shliach? The shliach will put the money where it's accessible to the Kohen, and that itself is a pidyon. And the reason why this question is so complex is because we have a rule in Matnos Kahuna, and pidyon ben is one of the 24 Matnos Kahuna, that it seems from the pasuk itself and the Sifri, and this is in Dvarim Perek Yud Ches, when it says V'nasan laKohen, the Torah is there talking about other matnas kahuna like Zorah Chayim V'Keva and so forth. It requires an Esina laKahuna, and the Sifri says laKohen Atzmo, meaning he has to give it directly from his hand into the hand of the Kohen. But the question is, does that apply in the case of Pidyon Haben? And here we have a major machlokes between the Rivash and other Rishonim. The Rivash was one of Chachmei Sfarad at the end of the period of the Rishonim, and he claims he has a diuk in the Rambam to prove that. No, I'm sorry. He doesn't have a diuk in the Rambam. The diuk in the Rambam is the other shita. But anyway, the Rivash's shita is that there's no shlichus in Pidyon Haben. That just like other matnas kahuna, the father of the son, the father has to give his gifts directly v'nosan, so too in Pidyon Haben. And the Ramah paskins like the Rivash in Yoredei Simon Shin Hey. However, there may be a possibility, according to the Achronim, that the Ramah would himself allow for a certain flexibility. First of all, does the Rivash actually say that there's no shlichus in Pidyon Haben? The Rambam writes that the bracha for Pidyon Haben is not liftos es haben, but al Pidyon Haben. The Gemara tells us in Psachim that any mitzvah that can be fulfilled through a shliach, you make the bracha with an al, like al bir chametz. I can appoint you as my shliach to check my house and burn my chametz. And the Rambam applies that rule to Pidyon Haben, implying quite clearly that the mitzvah can be fulfilled through a shliach. Perhaps even the Ramah would agree. When the Ramah says, in terms of the Rivash, that there's no shlichus for Pidyon Haben, what he means is classic shlichus. Classic shlichus would not apply to Pidyon Haben. What is classic shlichus? For example, in a get, if Ruvain appoints Shimon as a shliach, that's it. Ruvain's out of the picture. The shliach, that's Shimon, we'll call him, is now in the driver's seat. He will commission the writing of the get on behalf of Ruvain, and he will pay the sofer and the klafis, and he'll give the get over to the Isha, and that's shlichus. That shlichus cannot operate, according to Ramah, based on the Rivash, in Pidyon Haben, which would mean that to appoint a shliach for Pidyon Haben and the shliach will take out his own 5 slayim, that's not possible. However, the Achronim claim that if the father of the son takes out his own 5 shkolim and he gives it over to the shliach, that's not called shlichus. That means that the agent, so to speak, who's going to deliver the money is really the long arm of the father. He's simply doing the act of delivering the money to the Kohen. It's the father's money. He's not a shliach. He's a messenger, call it. And when the messenger transfers the father's money over to the Kohen, the father can make the bracha over Pidyon Haben together with the Shechiyanu and let this agent, who's not really a shliach, take the money of the father and put it in front of the Kohen's house and tell the Kohen to pick up the money. And at that point, the Pidyon is absolutely clinched. Now, again, exactly how to engineer this. For example, you start with a conversation with the Kohen between the father and the son and the Kohen. That can take place over Zoom. That's not an integral part of the Pidyon itself. And this means that we need, on the part of the Kohen, number 1, a verification that this baby needs Pidyon. Number 2, a verification of the fact that the Kohen is willing to accept 5 slayim and give up his rights to the child. All that can take place over Zoom. And at this point, we're going to expect once we have the Kohen on board over Zoom, the father now could recite the bracha al Pidyon Haben with Shechiyanu. But now he gives the money over to the Kohen. He can't give the money over to the Kohen. So what he does is he gives the money over to somebody. He agrees with the Kohen that there'll be a certain appointed place where the money will be placed. And then the Kohen picks up the money, and he has intention that when he's not going to be zocha in the money until the father of the son recites the bracha. The money will be placed on the table of the Kohen. The father will recite the bracha, the two brachas, over Zoom. The Kohen hears the two brachas, and immediately he can pick up the money and take it for himself. Okay. Now, I sent you an attachment with a number of issues. We don't have time to go through all of them, so we'll finish this up Lena, next Wednesday, but I do want to go through a few of them. First of all, there's some joker out there, I don't know who he is, that apparently put up on the internet that when you put a bracha, when you put a mask on, you should make a bracha. There ain't no such bracha. So a certain rabbi here, Rabbi Rubin, on my printout, it's page 7. I don't know, it might be page 6 on your printout, I don't know. He says, what should I do with this joker? You know, should I somehow circulate harsh words that we don't come up with new brachas that weren't established at the time of the Anshe Knesset Gadol? So Rav Willig, in his very inimitable style, you know, he gives a very short answer. He tells them to look in Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Reish Ches. Now, Siman Tov Reish Ches is about the mitzvah of Tochacha. It seems that the lady folk would very often eat their meal on Erev Yom Kippur right up to the moment of Shkia. And we have a mitzvah Tosefes Yom HaKippurim. And the Shulchan Aruch addresses the question, should we make a big deal about this and give them Tochacha? And basically the Machaber says, Nashim she'ochlos v'shosos ad chashecha v'enon yodos v'mitzvah lahosut michol hakodesh ein memachin biyada. Don't make a protest about it. Kidei shelo yavo lasos bizadon. And Ramah adds, the Amrinon mutav shiv shogig in v'al yud mezid. Better that they shouldn't know, and there'll be a shogeg rather than amazing. And the Mishnah Berurah comments, he says, Kevin shiodeh bevadai shelo yikablu bimenu, is therefore better not to say anything. If you think that you're dealing with an intelligent person who's sensitive to halacha and might be convinced that he's not doing it right, and even if it's a safek, sorech lamchos, do you have a mitzvah of tochacha, even when the iser is only an iser d'Rabbanan. So I think what Rav Willig is probably implying is that you figure this out, Rabbi Rubin. Are these people serious enough that if you tell them that they're going against the halacha, they'll listen to you? If they're not, then mutav shiv shogeg, you don't even bother with it. There's another question here from Rabbi Goldschmidt, and he wants to know, in outdoor minyanim, do we have an obligation, if there's no Kriyas HaTorah, that the moment we go back to the synagogues, which according to the Israeli law is today, actually today I davened inside a synagogue, should we be making up the Kriyas HaTorah that we've been missing over the last couple of weeks? And Rav Willig gives an answer low, that you should not be making that up. Now, if you fast forward to, again, I'm not sure what page it is in your numbers. Mine is a little different, perhaps. But page 9. So Rav Shechter answers a question here, Barichus, about making up parshias. And he quotes the Shulchan Aruch, Aruch Chaim, Simon Kuf Lamed Hey, who in turn quotes the Ramah, and the Ramah tells us a story about the Or Zarua. We mentioned the Or Zarua at the beginning of today's shir in Hilchas Avelus, but in Hilchas Kriyas HaTorah, the Or Zarua said that there was a minyan on Shabbos morning, and when they got time to Kriyas HaTorah, some problem, he doesn't tell you exactly what happened, and they never got to lane, and the whole day passed. And the Or Zarua says that next Shabbos they have to lane an entire extra parsha, and they basically have to do a Vayakel Pkudi kind of thing. But he says, the Or Zarua, that there's also an issue of tircha de tzibura, and therefore, if you have to make up one parsha together with the week's parsha, then you do two parshas. But if you have two parshas this week, like a double parsha, you don't add a third. That would be tircha de tzibura. And that's exactly how the Magen Avram codifies this. The Mishnah Berurah quotes the Magen Avram that we don't recite three sedras because that's tircha de tzibura. And Rav Shechter writes that there's a book, a biography of the Chazon Ish, with a story about 1948, in which the Chazon Ish was put into jail by the British authorities in Palestine because the Chazon Ish participated in a public demonstration against Chil Shabbos. That was against the law of the British mandate. And then, after a few weeks, when they freed the Chazon Ish from jail, and he had missed Kriyas HaTorah, he ran around and he tried to get 9 other people to agree to listen to 4 different parshios on Shabbos. And apparently, the logic of the Chazon Ish was that even if the Magen Avram is right that we don't add a third parsha, but that's only because it's tircha de tzibura. If you can get people who are not upset about this tircha de tzibura, you know, they like the Chazon Ish and they agreed to be part of it, then you could read 4 parshios. However, he quotes a beautiful tshuva here from the Shari Ephraim. Shai Ephraim was one of the great, very interesting personalities in modern Jewish history, Rav Zalman Margolis. And he writes that there's a fundamental difference between the Or Zarua, who wanted to get another parsha to be mashlim, unless there were 2, and he had a problem with tircha de tzibura, and another case. And that is a case of a Magefa and the like. He says that the Or Zarua required another parsha because the tzibur had gathered together for Shacharis. Once the tzibur gathered together for Shacharis, at that moment, what generates is a chiyuv kriyas haTorah. The tzibur itself, as a tzibur, generates kriyas haTorah. But if there's a terrible blizzard, a storm, and nobody shows up in shul, or our case of coronavirus, then there was no tzibur. There was never a chiyuv of kriyas haTorah. And therefore, says the Shari Ephraim, in similar circumstances where the tzibur never got together, there would be no chiyuv to repeat and make up the parsha. Only the Or Zarua required it because the tzibur had gotten together and they couldn't finish it all up. Now, Rav Shechter points out that in essence, the Shari Ephraim understands that the chiyuv of Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas tzibur, and therefore, if there's no tzibur, there's no chova, and that's against Reb Chaim, who used to quote my Rebbe Rav Salvation used to quote his 2 grandfathers. You know, his paternal grandfather's maternal grandfather. His maternal grandfather was the Pruzhina Rav, was the Rabbi Eliyahu Pruzhina. His last name was Feinstein. That's how the Rav is a little bit connected to the Feinstein family. But anyway, one of his grandfathers, that was Reb Chaim, thought that Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas yachid. So even in a case where the tzibur did not get together in shul, there was an obligation of Kriyas HaTorah which was not fulfilled, and therefore, given the logic of the Or Zarua, with the addition of the Chazon Ish, that if and when there be 3 parshas, you have to get the agreement of people, then we should be making up the parshas. The Shari Ephraim, on the other hand, holds like those who accept Rav Feinstein's approach. That's Rabbi Eliyahu Pruzhina, who held that the chova of Kriyas HaTorah is on the tzibur, and if there's no tzibur, then there's no chiyuv. So Lamaisa, if we go back to Rav Willig said that is there an obligation to make up missed parshios when Kriyas HaTorah becomes feasible again when the synagogues open? And Rav Willig says no. Well, let's make the following comments. He's right according to the Shari Ephraim and anyone who holds that Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas tzibur because there never was a chovas tzibur to begin with. He's not right if you hold that Kriyas HaTorah is a chovas yachid, like the Rav himself following in his grandfather's footsteps. I mean, his paternal grandfather, he would gather when he came in from Boston, and he couldn't he couldn't have heard Kriyas HaTorah on a Monday and Thursday, he would gather together a minyan and they would lane simply for him because he held the Kriyas HaTorah as a Chomas Yachid. Then it would seem that we missed all these parshios, so we have to make them up. Although we have that proviso, namely of Tircha de Tzibura, but if we can get the Tzibur to agree, maybe do it mincha time, spread it out, then we should certainly be doing that. Not only that, my second comment on Rav Willig is, although if we go like the Shari Ephraim and it's a Chovas Tzibur, maybe it's not like the Ozarua who had an emphasis on Tashlumin, but I still believe that even according to the Shari Ephraim, there would be a significant kiyum of Hashlam. There's no obligation because there was not a tzibur that was obligated at that. Okay, I'll stop now if anybody wants to ask any questions because I see it's already getting late. I want to say hello to Glenn and to Harry and Yudi and Ian is here. Right? Where is Ian? In Britain or is he? I don't know where he is. David is there by the Kaisel. He's already starting Yom Yerushalayim a little bit early. I like your beard, David. It's very nice.
I have a question, Rabbi.
I am here.
Please.
Yeah. Okay.
So 2 years ago, my mother passed away on Shabbos, and it was Shabbos, Shavuos. So funeral was not till Tuesday after Shabbos and Yontif. What was my status for those 3 days?
I would say, again, just shooting from the hip, that you're not an onen in that case. Why? Because in that case, his askus b'kvura becomes impossible. When you have a period of time in which the halach itself, not just the reality of the situation, removes any sort of possibility of kvura, that's a little bit different. Then I would be inclined to think that there's no aninus. There's really nothing you could do during those days of Shabbos and Yontif to help prepare and push towards the kvura. If you find in the poskim that there is a din of aninus, then those poskim are saying that since on Tuesday you're going to bury the dead, so then we bridge from the misa to the kvura, and all that is considered an oni. But I don't think so. I think that certainly this would be considered Ktefayim, what we spoke about, when we give it over.
People said to me when I came to shul, "What are you doing here? You should be home." And I said, "Home doing what? Missing Shabbos, missing."
So I don't know, I don't know if those people had research or not, but if you would have asked me, again, I would do more research on it, but my gut feeling would be that you're not an onen at that point.
But this must happen all the time to people on the Shabbos. I mean, this must happen every
and
Shabbos.
What's the minhag? I don't remember the minhag. All right, we'll check it out if you like. Just write me an email and I'll try to check. By the way, where are you? You're here in Israel?
I'm in London.
Hi, I thought.
I would have been there by now. We're coming after Pesach, but we're not going anywhere at the moment. Yeah.
Right. England got it pretty bad.
Very bad. Very bad. Yeah.
I heard in the Frum community, especially.
Oh yeah, we've had a lot of patiras, unfortunately. Yeah.
I heard also that I don't know, different stories about hospitals and this.
Yeah.
And that.
Yeah. It's not a good place here. We have to be very careful. Yeah. You're better off. You're definitely better off where you are at the moment, if not.
And we're going back to shuls now. The question is that a good idea? I don't know.
In the early days, they thought that much of the infection was spread in shuls. It was quite. I saw one of these.
They say about Purim. That Purim did us under. So we're going back to shuls. I hope it's not premature. I don't know.
Let's hope.
Yamic Learning Center, I think, is now trying to gather a minyan in shul for.
I saw a text from Rabbi
for tomorrow.
Myers.
I think I think they're up to eight people.
Yeah.
Okay then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope you got something out of the shiur.
I did indeed. The other ones are all a bit too early in the day for me here, the other shiurim. So this is good.
Well, you know what? If I have you, and this is not a paid political announcement, but I have 2 shiurim that perhaps you might want to think about. Tomorrow night, which is Thursday night, I have a shiur on Parsha based on Rav Soloveitchik. So that's at 9 p.m.
Okay.
And then, and then this year, right? Yeah. So those are the 2 shiurim that.
No, I have a Thursday night. I have a fixed Gemara shiur with a. Or I have to go to that. But thank you very much.
Oh, when you say Thursday night, you mean Thursday night on our clock? You mean?
Well, 7:15 here, so that's 9:15 at your time.
Oh, I see. I
You
see. I
said
got
yours
it.
was 9 o'clock. So this
I
is
got it. 7:15, which
this
is
is 9:15
9:15.
where you are. Yeah, yeah. We're 2
Right.
hours behind.
Right. When do I start my shir? At 9. But I finish
Yeah.
after 10. So if
Oh,
you're
okay. So
around.
after 10
Oh,
is
you
no.
might be. Wait, you know
Yeah.
what? You might be able to join.
Is it recorded?
Yes, I try to record it. You
Yeah.
might think about a Meshech Chochma shir, but that would be 7:30 a.m. on your clock. Is that too early for you? You're in
It's a bit
David.
early. It's a bit early, yeah.
Because I'm really having a lot of fun with that, with Meshech Chochma.
What
That's
is that
9.
every day? Is that every day?
No, just on Fridays. You know,
Oh,
we'll
I
close
see.
Shabbos.
Okay.
That's at 9:30.
Are you giving it this week? Because
Yeah,
Yom Yerushalayim.
tomorrow, day after tomorrow.
Yeah. Even though
All
it's
right,
Yom Yerushalayim. Yeah.
just keep it in mind, just in case.
Okay. I will try. Thank you very much.
All right, all the best.
No guarantees. Although I
Yeah.
must tell you, Nate's at the moment here is about 5 o'clock.
Yeah, here it's 5:30-ish, 5:30.
Okay, so it's quite tough.
Yeah,
Quite
we're not
tough.
far behind you. Yeah.
Okay.
All
All
right,
the best. Thanks very
All right,
much.
thank
Bye.
you.